Hello and welcome to Myths About the Unaffiliated, a lecture by Alan Cooperman, Director of Religion Research at Pew Research Center. My name is Emma Robinson, and I am the project manager for the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project. As we begin today, please join me for a land acknowledgement. While we gather virtually for this event, from places near and far, we acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we are on today, and acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Canada. The Nonreligion in a Complex Future project is based at the University of Ottawa. Please join us as we pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Thank you. So now I will introduce today's lecturer. Alan Cooperman is Director of Religion Research at Pew Research Center. Pew is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and non-advocacy research center. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Emma and Lori, for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this. Now comes that awkward moment when I try to share my screen, which I should be able to do. And go. Great. Okay, so I don't need to say anything about Pew Research Center because you already did it. We don't take policy positions, and we study religion because we think that it matters to individuals and to societies around the world, not because we're promoting any particular religion or religion in general. You asked me to speak today about the nuns, and I've set up some myths about the nuns. I'm going to acknowledge that that some of these myths are really straw men. You may or may not know anybody who actually believes these things. That's okay. It's a conceit for a lecture, probably as good as any, maybe not the best, but anyway, we could talk about that a little bit later. Let me make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about what we're talking about. Who are the nuns? The nuns are people who don't identify with any religion. In Pew polls, we ask a standard religion question that goes something like this: what is your present religion, if any? Are you Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox as in Greek, or Russian Orthodox, Mormon, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, something else, or nothing in particular? And three of those particular response options, atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, we lump together, acknowledging that those are somewhat different answers, but we lump those together as the unaffiliated, those who don't identify with any particular religion. And if we look at Pew polling over the last approximately 15 years, we see a pretty consistent and strong trend of decline in the numbers of Americans who identify, this is in the United States alone, of American adults over age 18 who identify with Christianity. It's been dropping at about 1 percentage point per year on average, approximately. Non-Christian religions are pretty stable at about 5 or 6% of the population. You can see all those groups lumped together just for simplicity's sake as one line at the bottom. And the group that's been growing rapidly at a rate of about 1 percentage point per year in increase is the no religion or unaffiliated or nuns category. Pew Research Center, by the way, has sometimes been falsely credited with inventing the term nuns. We didn't. We actually have some concerns about that term and its sort of negative connotations. We prefer the term religiously unaffiliated, but I'll use both terms interchangeably today. If we look at other data, other ways of asking a religious identification question in the United States, you'll find somewhat different numbers for what percentage of US adults are nuns. This is a somewhat old chart, only through 2014. The last time we went back and looked at data for half a dozen or so other consistent polling organizations. But the key point is that anybody who does polling in the United States and asks a religious identification question in a consistent way over time finds the same trend. the same increase in the share of the population that does not identify with any religion. You find that in the General Social Survey, you find it in the American National Election Survey, you find it in the surveys done by major American news organizations, and so on. And just to give a sense in absolute numbers, Pew Research Center did two major surveys, very parallel surveys in 2007 and 2014. We call them the Religious Landscape Studies, each with 35,000 people in them, adults. And our estimate based on those studies is that between 2000 and 2014, the absolute number of US adults who don't identify with any religion rose by almost 20 million people in that 7-year period. Again, that's a 2014 data, but we're upwards of 60 million US adults who don't identify with any religion today. So it is a very large share of the US population and a very large absolute number of people. All right, so now I wanted to sort of talk about some elements of what we know about the nuns. And again, to emphasize that Pew Research Center isn't taking positions. We don't take normative positions. I'm not decrying the rise of the nuns or applauding it. Our niche really is in measurement and trying to understand it. So let's start with one of the things that I used to hear a lot. I haven't heard it so much recently, but I used to hear people saying, oh, you know, this thing, this non-religion, that's a coastal elites thing. That's something that happens on the East Coast and the West Coast, but Middle America is not changing. And that's flatly wrong. If we look at these figures, we can see that this is actually a very broad-based social change that's taking place from different bases and to different degrees, but in the same direction of movement from identification with religious groups, mostly in the United States, Christianity, to being religiously unaffiliated. It's taking place among people of all major racial and ethnic groups as defined in the US Census, whites, blacks, Hispanics. It's taking place across all major regions of the country among men and women, and most notably those who say that this is something that is happening because college professors are poisoning the minds of their students and taking them away from religious tradition to atheism, that sort of thing that one occasionally hears. It's not true, because we see the rise of the nuns among people who do not go to college, as well as among Americans who do. Again, apologize. These are somewhat straw men. Let's acknowledge that, no problem. But there's this idea that nuns equates to atheist, i.e. no religion means someone who has no religion has no religious beliefs or practices whatsoever. I'm not sure if there's anyone on the surface of the earth who, depending on one's definition of religion or spirituality, has no beliefs or practices, and it's certainly demonstrably false to think that the nuns are all atheists. In fact, if we just look at the three categories that the Pew question allows us easily to subdivide and call out, atheist, agnostic, and nothing in particular. The nothing in particulars are the lion's share of the unaffiliated in the United States. Now, as you can see in this table, all three groups have been rising in size over approximately the last 15 years. The share of Americans who are atheists has roughly doubled from 2% to 4%. The share who are agnostic has more than doubled from 2% to 5%. And the share of those who are nothing in particular has not quite doubled, though it's getting in that range, going from 12% to 20% over that period of time. And if we look at specific beliefs and practices, we see that the nuns many of them hold some religious or spiritual beliefs. A majority of them, as of 2014, when we did the Religious Landscape Study, which is still really our best big data, and it's why I know that it's somewhat out of date, but I'm going to keep using it, and I'll keep calling out if I can that it's a little bit old. But the share of Americans as of 2014 who were religiously unaffiliated believing God was the majority, 61%. Many, in fact, roughly a third, said that religion was at least somewhat important in their lives. What the nuns don't tend to do in any substantial numbers is attend religious services on a regular basis. So it's less than, it's about 1 in 10 of the nuns who say that they attend religious services at least once a month, again, as of 2014. Now, of course, those numbers are much lower than in the US population as a whole. So without doubt, the nuns are less religious by these conventional measures than religiously affiliated Americans. And that's also very clear in our data and frankly in the data that anybody else has. There's another point though that's interesting that some people may not realize, and that is that over time, the nuns, this group of people who are religiously unidentified, have been becoming, again, by these sort of conventional measures, less religious over time. So not only is the number of nuns growing, but the self-described beliefs and practices of the nuns are becoming more secular, less religious. So for example, the Share who say that religion is somewhat, at least somewhat important in their lives, or very important in their lives, has declined by about 7 percentage points between 2007 and 2014. The Share who say they believe in God has also declined by 9 or so points during that 7-year period. And these trends, by the way, we think have continued since 2014, but again, 2014 is and 2007 are our 2 strongest data points with very large and very parallel surveys. That's why I keep using them. All right, another myth, maybe straw man about the nuns is that while they aren't conventionally religious, they must be highly spiritual. It's this sort of idea of replacement, that religion must be replaced by something maybe not organized or conventional or dogmatic, but surely they must be highly spiritual in some other way. And first of all, if we ask people whether that's just a self-description, whether they think of themselves as religious people or think of themselves as a spiritual person, you'll notice actually that most of the affiliated think of themselves as spiritual, and a plurality of the unaffiliated do not call themselves spiritual. 46% call themselves neither religious nor spiritual on these two separate questions. If we ask about a variety of kind of generic spirituality questions, like do you believe in spiritual energy and physical things such as mountains, trees, and crystals, we find that the unaffiliated are actually very similar in their share who believe that to the affiliated. And then in most of these things, with the exception potentially of yoga, which skews young, and disaffiliation also skews young, in general, we don't see any higher levels of spiritual belief among the unaffiliated than among the affiliated. So again, I'm not claiming that nuns have no religious or spiritual beliefs, but the idea that they are their lesser religious involvements, beliefs, behaviors must be compensated by some other higher spiritual levels. We don't see that in our data. Maybe we're not asking the right questions. I put a half a dozen up. We've asked more than that, but I just don't see evidence for that. And we'll be moving along to maybe a little bit more interesting myth. And you'll note that some of these things I do think there's more than a grain of truth in, and this is one of them. It's the idea that, where it's really the question, is the rise of the nuns really a change in behavior, or is it just a change in the way people describe themselves? Is it a reflection, for example, of declining social desirability of religious identification in the United States as a result of perhaps of scandals or other things that have happened with organized religion? Maybe people are just changing the way they talk about themselves, but nothing has actually happened in what they do and what they believe. So that's a really interesting question. And there is some truth in it, in the sense that we do see that between 2007 and 2014, these two major surveys, parallel surveys that we did, we see that the share of people who have low levels of religious commitment, that's a scale that combines self-described levels of attendance, frequency of prayer, and belief in God. Those who are low on that, between those two data points, those two time points, the share who describe themselves as unaffiliated rose. So in that sense, if we were to sort of freeze frame and look at people with low levels of religiosity, we did see that they were over time seem to be becoming more likely to describe themselves as nuns. So in that sense, yeah, maybe there is some evidence that at least part of the rise of the nuns is simply a change in the way people talk about themselves. But there is more to the picture than that. And the key thing to realize, I think, is that there's also a rising share of US adults, a rising percentage, who are in that category of low levels of religious commitment. So people in that category may be becoming more likely to out themselves, so to speak, if we think religious identification still has some social desirability, to say, no, I don't believe I'm not part of any of these groups. I'm atheist, I'm agnostic, I'm just nothing in particular. That may be happening, but at the same time, that size of that category is also growing. And frankly, you may be wondering, you're all social scientists, wondering, well, what about the cut points? And, what is medium commitment? What is low commitment? What is high commitment, et cetera? Aren't those artificial cut points? And how does the picture change if you change them? And that's an excellent question, too. And I just tell you that, I suppose probably if you gave me $10 million to find some way of looking at these data in which the high category was growing and the low category was stable, maybe there's some way I could possibly do it, but it would be a real stretch. Looking at a variety of different scales, a variety of different cut points, it's just very, very obvious that the low end of the spectrum is growing in numbers in the United States, and the high end is at best stable and almost certainly shrinking. The middle is really the category that the cut points could change, and you could either, depending on how you define the middle of the spectrum, maybe you could find a way to have stability or decline in the middle rather than at the top. We could speak more about that, but the key thing is to know the bottom end of the spectrum, without doubt, is growing in the United States. This gives way to one of the most common things that I continue to hear, especially from clergy in the United States, who clearly have some skin in this game, and what they tend to believe, and there is some truth in it, is that the nuns are a young group, and that as people age, they become more religious, and so they come back to religion. So I obviously can't predict the future, and I'm not trying to. That's why I say the answer to this is maybe, maybe not. But I can look at past trends. And first of all, it for sure is true that older people tend to be more religious. There may well indeed be a set of life cycle effects, whereas we go through life's passages of marriage or partnering, childbearing, and confronting of illness, age, mortality, et cetera, that we become more religious. That does seem to be, there's good evidence of that across lots of studies. And we see in a simple cross-sectional way in Pew data, and you would see it in general social survey data, et cetera, that older people tend to be more religious than younger people. So there's a grain of salt in this for sure. But here's the chart that I think is really important, and that clergy or others who are holding out for themselves and their organizations the broad hope that large numbers of young people are going to come back to religion as they age. The reality is that it hasn't happened in the recent past with any of the generations. Now, I'm also aware that the sort of conventional generational cohorts that we use in the United States are baloney. There's really nothing especially unique about each of these sets of years. And so I would just say to you that if we didn't do this by generations and we did it by 10-year birth cohorts, we would see exactly the same pattern. So I'm just using generations in this chart for convenience because people are familiar with them, but you would see the same thing. And that pattern is that each cohort of young adults has come of age with lower levels of religious identification than previous cohorts. Now, sometimes close to the immediate previous cohort, but lower levels of identification than prior cohorts. So this chart is showing the share who are unaffiliated. So each cohort is higher in the share of unaffiliated people, each young new cohort. And then the interesting thing to see, and you can especially see this with the boomers, because this is general social survey data going back to 1972 when they first started asking the religious identification question. And the earlier generations, the greatest generation, they were already in middle age by the time the general social survey started doing this in 1972. And somewhat true with the silent generation, they were in their 30s. Or 30s or 40s. But the baby boomer generation, where we first pick up in the general social survey enough baby boomers to analyze as a cohort, they were at 13% unaffiliated. And we could follow that generation all the way to the present. And we see that as the baby boomer generation has aged, they have not returned in overall in the share who identify with religion as they've gotten older. And the same is true. We can see that a little bit with Gen X. We first picked them up in the late 90s, and we follow them over time. We also don't see that change. So it's entirely possible that what's going on here is a broad period effect that is washing out an age or life cycle effect where individuals are becoming more religious as they get older, but the overall period effect is wiping it out or washing it out. That's entirely possible, but I would not see evidence thus far that as generations or birth cohorts get older, they are tending to become more affiliated as they age in the United States. That's not happening. It doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the future. These patterns are not necessarily predictive of the future, but that's what we see so far. I wonder whether now might be a good moment, Emma, just to pause and take a question or two. I've got a lot more slides and frankly some more interesting things to show, but I think I've droned on for a while, so maybe there's a question.
Sure, absolutely. So we actually had the same question, roughly speaking, from three of our attendees. So Sarah from Wilkins-Laflamme, Dusty Hosley, and Courtney Applewhite. I will read Courtney Applewhite's question. Courtney says, as you mentioned, the religious landscape study is nearly 10 years old now. Does Pew have plans to launch another survey that will be able to report more data on the nuns today, especially with the apparent rise of unaffiliation in Gen Z?
Yes, thank you for the question, and I really appreciate the spirit behind it, which I take as encouragement. We had planned to do the third religious landscape study in 2021, the first one 2007, second 2014, 2021 biblical 7-year cycles or something like that, I don't know. But COVID struck, and it did not seem like an appropriate moment to measure religious trends in the midst of a pandemic that basically shut down most of the institutional religious activity in the United States, at least in part and in many places, just entirely for large periods of time. So we thought we'd wait out the pandemic. And I recognize that the pandemic isn't quite over, but we've stopped waiting and we are actively planning for another religious landscape study. I don't know the exact timing of it because we also have to raise the funds to do it. It's become much more expensive than it used to be. It was always a very, very expensive project, and we don't talk about the exact dollar amounts, but you all know these are multi-million-dollar studies, and so we're going to need to raise some. We have the Pew Charitable Trust, our mothership, will definitely support it very handsomely and generously, but we're also talking with some funders, and basically the kind of timeline that I have in mind is to try to get all the partnerships, the money, and the planning done this year. We're also doing a bunch of preliminary studies this year to help us figure out what new questions to try to add and what we might be able to subtract, and just to get us in shape for the study. And then with luck, I don't want to promise, but with luck, we carry it out in 2023. And depending on exactly when we go into the field, maybe we'd even get a report out in 2023, but I think probably more likely we'd be reporting data in 2024 and making the data set publicly available maybe in 2024, if that timing has. And for sure, we'll make the data set available as we did with both of the others, freely available. Of course, we'll strip out some potentially personally identifiable information so that individual respondents can't be identified, but we are committed to making the data available. We're also committed, by the way, to trying to move toward FAIR principles and improve the metadata, and we've always released good code books. But anyway, we're trying to do even better on the data sharing front. Thank you for the question, and again, especially the spirit of encouragement behind it.
Great, thank you, Alan. And then let's just do one more question for this break, if that works for you. So Pascal Tanner's one says, a very interesting presentation so far. What can you say about the group of people who are not only religiously unaffiliated, but also involved in atheist activities, in brackets, secularism or humanism? Is this group of people large enough to show up in your surveys and can be analyzed with significant results?
So in the religious landscape studies, we can take a look at atheists, and because atheists are growing, when we do the third religious landscape study, I think we'll be able to dig even deeper into atheists, because while we could look at atheists as a whole in the 2014 study, we wouldn't be able to do things like look at younger atheists versus older atheists, or divide atheists by gender, or etc. But what we can see about atheists, and we know from a variety of other studies, is that they tend to be, on the whole, quite knowledgeable about religion. Actually, when we do factual questions about religion, atheists, agnostics, and Jewish Americans and Mormons tend to come out higher than the general population in terms of religious knowledge. Perhaps that's because they are minorities, and so they know something about their own religious traditions or their own views, and also about the broader society, but also high levels of education, of course, on average among atheists. Organized activity among atheists as of the 2014 study still seemed to be pretty low. And we would not have had in the 2014 or the 2007 studies enough atheists who regularly participate in some sort of an atheistic gathering to be able to analyze them separately. But that's a really interesting question, and it might be the kind of thing we should try to dig into in the next study if we thought we would have enough to look at. That's the kind of thing we're trying to do in these preparatory studies, is figure out what's a waste of a question. And the question, the space on the survey is extremely valuable, of course. But the other approach to it is qualitative, ethnographic, and that's not so much our specialty. But you probably know a great deal more than I do. There have been numerous studies of ethical humanist societies and the like. So I meant like ethical, humanist, secularist groups that meet, and anecdotally, yeah, there's quite a bit of activity there, but it is maybe at best right. Maybe it's going to catch the point where we could get it in our largest surveys. It's still just a tiny, tiny fraction of the US population.
Thank you so much, Alan. Let's turn back to your presentation now, but we will do another Q&A at the end of the presentation today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Emma, and thanks for the good questions. All right, so I think this gets a little more interesting now. This next myth is this idea that being a nun is like going to the Hotel California in the Eagles song. You can check in, but you can't check out. And that's just not true. So if we look in general at religious switching in the United States, we see that, again, as of 2014, and these numbers have changed, 90% of Americans, as of 2014, American adults, told us that in childhood, they were raised in some particular religion. 18% of US adults at that time were unaffiliated. 72% were still affiliated. So if you do the simple math of 72 out of 90, the retention rate, that is the share of people who were raised with a religion, who are still in that religion or still have a religion, is 80%, or was 80%. And that's still have a religion, some religion, maybe not the same one, as of 2014. Now, if we look at the nuns, 9.2%, and here I'm using the percentage points just because it becomes important to figuring the ratio. 9.2% of US adults were raised with no religion as of 2014. And 4.3% of US adults still were unaffiliated. They're raised with no religion and still have no religion. But 4.3% had taken on a religion. So the retention rate of the unaffiliated was 53% as of 2014. If we put that in a compare that with other religious groups, you see that the retention rate, the share of people raised unaffiliated who are still unaffiliated, is sort of middle of the pack, or even kind of at the low end compared with many other religious groups in the United States. So 59% at that time of people who were raised as Catholics were still Catholic. And 65% of those who were raised as evangelical Protestants were still evangelical Protestants. And 75% of those who were raised as Jewish were still Jews by religion, that is, in the Jewish faith. We're not counting other Jewish ideas about Jewish identity, just Jew as Jew by religion in this analysis. And the unaffiliated at 53% is kind of at the low end. Or another way of putting it is that they don't have, the unaffiliated don't have an especially good retention rate. Lots of people who were raised as unaffiliated go on to take on a religion in adulthood in the United States. On the other hand, if you look at the size of the groups, the number of people who are affiliated is so huge, and the number of people who are unaffiliated, though it's growing, is still a minority of the population. And so even with a lower retention rate among the unaffiliated than among the affiliated, you still have a ratio of about 4 to 1, people moving from having been raised with a religion to, in adulthood, not having a religion. 4 of those people for every 1 person who was raised without a religion and in adulthood takes on a religious identification in the United States. I mean, we could talk a lot about this, and one important thing, and I'll get into a little bit more, I hope, a little later on, is that all these ratios, these retention rates, I'm talking about 2014 as one moment in time, but the reality is that the retention rates are constantly changing. And actually the retention rate of the unaffiliated does seem to be rising or improving from the point of view of someone who is unaffiliated, if you will. And the retention rates of most, if not all, major religious groups in the United States are declining by generation or by age cohort, so younger cohorts have lower retention rates. Like the share of young people who were raised as Catholics who are still Catholic is lower than the share of older people who were raised as Catholic who are still Catholic, despite the fact that disaffiliation takes place across the life course. So this is not actually, I've shown this sort of a static, and of course it's not actually a static picture. All right, another myth is that nuns are increasing as a share of the world's population. And this would be correct if the only factor in religious change was religious switching, because globally more people do move from having a religion to not having a religion than in the other direction, just as in the United States, because of the size of the groups, there's more movement out of religion than into religion. That's also true globally through religious switching. But you got to put your demographer's hat on and recognize that religious switching is by no means the only factor in population change. And we could forget about migration for a moment if we're thinking about it globally, because people are moving around but not changing the ultimate numbers. But we can't forget about fertility. And fertility differences between religious groups are really quite important globally. And the unaffiliated globally have a low fertility rate. The total fertility rate of the unaffiliated, calculated by our demographers after years of siphoning up all kinds of censuses and population registers and other data around the world, large surveys like demographic and health surveys, especially valuable in this regard. On average, women around the world who affiliate with a religion have almost one full child more in their lifetime than women who don't affiliate with a religion. It's a significant fertility advantage for religion or for religious populations, speaking of globally. And there's also population momentum that those high fertility rates build up. And that population momentum manifests itself in younger versus older populations. So the median worldwide as of 2010, median age was 28. The median age of many religious groups is that or higher. That is, they're aging. Like the world's population as a whole, and have somewhat older populations than the worldwide median. The Muslims, the fastest growing group globally, not through religious switching, but largely because they're concentrated in areas with high population growth. Their median age as of 2010 was 23 years. The unaffiliated are quite an older population, or as old as Buddhists worldwide, and rivaling Manchu is the oldest of the large groups that we're able to look at. So the unaffiliated are an aging population with a low birth rate globally, because of where they're located in countries with aging populations and low birth rates. I'm not attributing this necessarily to religious teachings. This is really about geographic distribution. But one thing we can see, broadly speaking, I think it's a really interesting correlation, and people like Ronald Engelhart have made a lot out of this. It's probably familiar to you, that the countries with the fastest growing populations with the highest fertility rates tend to be highly religious, while those with shrinking populations tend to be less religious. I'm not implying an arrow of causality there. You could reverse the way of thinking about it, saying that countries with lower populations or lower fertility rates tend to be less religious. Those with higher fertility rates tend to be more religious. Engelhardt and others, of course, do have an arrow of causality there. We can talk about that later. But the key point to realize is that the very highly religious parts of the world are the fastest growing parts. So sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, some parts of Latin America, those places are highly religious. So as a result, our demographers' best assessment as of a few years ago, and we're again constantly siphoning up data and looking at it, but is that actually that as a share of the world's population, the nuns, the unaffiliated, are declining as a share of the world's population. They're rising in absolute numbers because the whole world's population is rising in absolute numbers, but largely because of these fertility differentials, they're declining in share. That's our best estimate, at least. So a related myth is that the nuns are going to grow everywhere, and ultimately, as Peter Berger suggested back in the 1960s, it didn't turn out to exactly be the case, that by the year 2000, there would be only a few religious people sort of huddled together in isolated groups, like sort of Aboriginal peoples. I don't know. I'm not making predictions for the future, but I think that there's reason to believe that is not exactly the case. And I'd like to run you through a quick thought experiment about the United States. If we start out with the population size, basically the ratio of unaffiliated to affiliated that we had in the United States in something like 1980, where 95% of the US population was religiously affiliated, 5% was unaffiliated. And we imagine this is, a country of 100 people just for simplicity's sake. And we take the retention rates that we found in our survey. And again, if we were to imagine these as not moving retention rates. And so we have 20% of the people who are religiously affiliated as children become unaffiliated in adulthood, and 47% of the unaffiliated, those who are raised as unaffiliated, become affiliated in adulthood. This is sort of inverse of the retention rates that I showed you earlier. 80% affiliated retention rate, 53% unaffiliated retention rate. So just take the reverse of that as the defection rate and multiply that out. And this is at time 2, one generation, or as long as one life cycle after that, you have a substantial rise in the share of people who are unaffiliated. And if you take time 3 with those same retention rates, the unaffiliated are still growing, and at time 4 they're still growing. But note that their growth is the speed of their growth is declining. Again, because as they grow as a share of the population with a lower retention rate than the unaffiliated, so the ratio of people moving in each direction is changing. And interestingly, at time 5, we hit equilibrium, and with larger numbers of people who are unaffiliated, but with a lower defection rate, and with smaller numbers of unaffiliated but a higher defection rate, you hit this equilibrium moment, and it just doesn't change thereafter. Now, I don't mean to predict that this is what's going to happen. That's not the point here. The point is just that you could have theoretically a lot of disaffiliation for a long period of time. But given the ratios and where they are, there's also plenty of possibilities for equilibrium points. And of course, 30-70 is not the only possible equilibrium points, depending on what the numbers are and the ratios of people moving in each direction that could change. And then, of course, to complicate the picture, the retention rates, as I alluded to earlier, are not actually fixed. They're changing over time. So it is also theoretically possible if the retention rate of the affiliated just continued to decline, and the retention rate of the unaffiliated continued to rise, then hypothetically, yes, you could get to a point where the population became 100% unaffiliated. But there's also plenty of equilibrium points in between that are at least theoretically possible. Emma, I think we're probably getting close to time, but I do have two more slides that are really interesting. I am not trying to take a position about whether disaffiliation is a good thing or a bad thing for individuals or societies. I have no position on that, and not just because I'm sort of chicken. I just think human behavior is very complicated, and I don't think these things are all kind of one way or the other. I think there's a lot of gray in them. But let's make the case for why actually the rise of the nuns might not be beautiful. Why it actually might be not such a great thing. And I think the obvious case for that, which you're all probably familiar with, is that there's some evidence that religious groups or people who are religiously identified do tend to engage in some pro-social behaviors at higher rates than those who are not religiously identified. So classically in our data, but also in lots of other data, people who are highly religious tend to donate more money and to volunteer more. And actually some studies will say they tend to donate more money, not only to religious groups, but even to non-religious or secular organizations at higher rates than those who are less religious. Now, for sure, it's not the case that religious people are in every respect more altruistic and better behaved than, or more pro-social, if you want to put it that way, than non-religious people. There's a whole bunch of things that we've asked questions about. For example, do you recycle? Do you overeat? How often do you exercise? How much do you consider whether people receive a fair wage when you decide whether the people who produce something, when you decide whether to buy it? And frankly, on all these things, at least in terms of self-descriptions, highly religious people are no higher, no more moral, if you will, no more pro-social in their behaviors than less religious people. So by no means is it all realms of behavior that are measurably higher among religious people. But what we do find as a broad statement is that religiously active people tend to be also more socially active in all the other types of civic organizations and activities that we try to measure. And I've listed a bunch here. I think we've actually asked about 14 or so different types of activities, and people who are religiously active tend to be more engaged in all of those. Again, these are self-assessments or self-descriptions than those who are not active in religious organizations, which leads me to think that this is partly possibly a characterological predisposition. One might think of it this way, that joiners are joiners. Religious activity is a big thing in the United States, and people who are out there doing a lot of stuff socially in their communities tend to, among the things they do, be involved in religious activities, but they also tend to be more involved in parent organizations, in book clubs, in youth groups, in community and neighborhood associations, and in political activity. And so it isn't necessarily that religion is the driver or the motivator of that behavior. It might actually be the reverse, that they are involved in religious groups, religious activities, because they're socially outgoing or motivated people. And there's more fancy terms we could use to think about this. But again, I like to simplify it and just say, to me, it looks a little bit like joiners are joiners and non-joiners are non-joiners. To add a little bit of an element to this, we can also see, if we look at age, again, younger cohorts are less religiously affiliated. They are also less likely to engage in some of the pro-social behaviors that are most closely associated with religious activity, such as volunteering and donating, by pretty, substantial differences over time. And this, of course, brings us to the famous Robert Putnam argument about decline of social capital, broadly speaking, in his book Bowling Alone. And I know you're all familiar with it, so I won't belabor it. But the broad point is that it's not just religion that is in decline, but many types of bricks and mortar institutions that bring people together are declining in the shares of Americans who engage in them, and all across the United States, you find fraternal organizations that are going belly up. Their buildings are empty, and so on, and fewer and fewer people engaging in these sort of regular bricks and mortar membership type or organizations of all sorts, with maybe the possible exception of gyms and health clubs. Last set of slides here, sort of the reverse. So I've made that case for why, I think maybe the case for why someone who is unaffiliated, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, might give any pause or have any thought about why the continued growth of disaffiliation might not be a great thing. And the answer is it might not be a great thing, really, if what's behind disaffiliation is a broader set of social changes. It's not just about religion, it's about atomization of society and decline of social capital, and bridging capital in particular, in Putnam's terminology. And that perhaps should be something that even people who don't have a vested sense of religion ought to give at least a little pause. And on the reverse side of it, why is the decline or the rise of the nuns actually maybe not such a terrible thing, maybe a good thing. And I mentioned Ronald Engelhardt, the University of Michigan World Values Survey, a couple of times already in this talk. And I find his thinking on these issues very provocative. I'm not necessarily fully on board with the existential insecurity thesis, but basically Engelhardt and Pippa Norris and others have outlined this broad global theory that the secularization or the decline of religious identity, belief, and behavior around the world is driven by rising levels of existential security in parts of the world where that's happening, and that the continuation of strong religious affiliation, belief, and behavior is driven by existential insecurity in places in the world where people feel mortal dread, fear for their lives and for their safety and for their economic well-being. Famously, Ronald Engelhardt did have to acknowledge a mistake in some of the data, and the United States, it turns out, is not actually the place with the greatest change in religion. It's maybe fourth or something like that worldwide. But broadly speaking, right up to the time of his passing, Engelhardt continued to argue that not a word needs to be changed in this thesis, that it still holds up in the data. And I would say that broadly speaking, in Pew Research Center data, global data that we gather, we also see some of the same correlations that he points out, and they are really interesting, and they're pretty strong. And we can see, for example, that places that are richer, with higher countries with higher levels of GDP per capita, tend to have lower levels of daily prayer, and places that are less wealthy or poorer tend to have higher rates of daily prayer. We can see that there's a pretty straight line correlation with worship attendance and life expectancy. That the countries with the lowest life expectancies are the countries with the highest levels of weekly worship attendance. Again, that you can also see by the colors that this is really largely a geographic concentration. So we're looking at largely sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa up in the upper left-hand quadrant. And we're looking at Western Europe and the developed world in the lower right-hand quadrant. And in countries where people attend school longer, they tend to go to church less often. So again, correlation causation issues, but one could make the case that religion is broadly associated with a bunch of bad things, with short lives, with low levels of education, with poverty and so on. And therefore that secularization or disaffiliation broadly is a marker of progress, or at least moves toward existential security worldwide. That's sort of the case that Engelhardt made. Again, I'm not actually trying to champion it, but I do, because I think that there are some important exceptions, particularly Muslim majority societies where there's been a lot of economic growth, but not necessarily any decline in religion and so on. But I put that out there. And Emma, let's go to some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alan. We may end up going a few minutes over today, but we would love to get to your questions. I don't think we'll have time for all of them, but we will get through as many as we can. So thank you all so much for being so engaged. The first question from Ryan Cragen: is it a fair comparison to look at the religiously active compared to the non-religious? Wouldn't a fairer comparison be to look at the religiously active compared to the, quote, secularly active, and then the religiously inactive versus the non-religiously inactive? He says, I think Alan kind of hinted at this, but I'd like him to discuss it a little bit more.
Yeah, that's fair, Ryan. In this, what I was trying to say is that religious activity is a very big sector of civic activity in the United States, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, and frankly, non-religious. So you're talking about like non-religious people, but being engaged in what exactly in their non-religion? I guess there's some of that. It sort of relates to the earlier question about whether there are lots of atheists gathering for atheist meetings, or lots of agnostics gathering for agnostic meetings, or something like that. And I just, there's some of that going on, but that's a tiny, tiny portion of the picture. So yeah, I guess we could compare, make that comparison. I certainly am not trying to make the claim that religion is the motivator for people to be engaged in various kinds of civic activities. But it is associated with higher levels of civic activity in a place like the United States, where it's such a dominant force in our landscape. You know what, let me say one more thing about that, because you're also cherry picking, Ryan, in the sense, if you're talking about, you want me to think about atheists or the people who are non-religious who are active, because the reality is that among the disaffiliated, among the unaffiliated, there's that very big share of people who are not so much anti-religion or even thoughtful or caring about religion as simply disinterested. You see this particularly those who describe themselves as nothing in particular. When you take measures of religious knowledge, they're very, very low in religious knowledge, where atheists are very high. And I think the thing to be concerned about is those people. It's I'm not, sensitive. If I'm thinking about this just in terms of what's good for society and good for individuals, and not trying to take a moral position on it. Atheists who are active, highly educated, pro-social, that's great, nothing wrong with that. The thing to worry about is what if disaffiliation is part of an atomization of society and a growing share of people who are just sort of falling out of social connections. And it's not that the atheists are the unusual group there. The big lion's share of the unaffiliated is the people who are disinterested, and maybe they're not doing much of anything. They're not replacing in place of religion, they're not doing something else. They're just less socially connected. Because we don't see that the people who are unaffiliated are doing more of anything. They're doing less of all the things that we can measure. So maybe the thing to worry about is loneliness and atomization among at least a portion of the unaffiliated.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question. I wish we had another half hour today. This has been so wonderful. But this question jumped out to me just because it's something related to what the NCF is looking at as well. Pascal Tanner asks, what can you say about the relationship between non-religion and migration for the US? It's well known that migration has a strong influence on certain religious groups, but what about the religiously non-affiliated?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So we have some data on religious identification of migrants, but it's not the greatest. It mostly comes from one or two sources. The US government does do some tracking for new green card holders, but mostly we're looking at Princeton-based surveys, as I recall the data, and I'm not an expert on this, but as I recall the data, we get a lot of selective migration to the United States of Christians, even from countries that don't have Christian majorities. So, from places like China, you get a disproportionate number of Chinese who move to the United States who are Christian or become Christian in the United States, and the same is probably true from the Middle East, et cetera. And so my general surmise or guess would be that we don't have substantial numbers, or that if anything, migration is on the whole in adding to the share of Americans who identify with religious groups. But the other thing that we see with migration is that in a generation or two, migrants in most respects tend to look like the population of the country they've moved to. So migration, unless people are living in particular enclaves, et cetera, or extraordinary circumstances, generally, migrants do come to look so much like the general population in terms of all kinds of things, education rates in the United States, fertility rates, and all that. Don't want to be standing here as a great applauder of all things American, but incorporation of new immigrants is maybe one of the things that the United States has generally been. Well, it's even a dated statement. Anyway, in European countries, I think there's some evidence that it takes longer for new immigrants to come to be like the native-born population in terms of education in the United States. Within a generation or two, they look very much like the US population as a whole. So I suspect the same thing happens with religion. It's a short-term boost to maybe the share who are affiliated, but I don't think it is a lasting impact.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. Like I said, I wish we had more time today. To close out today's event, I am now going to hand things over to the principal investigator of the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project, Lori Beeman.
Hi, Alan. Thank you so much for being with us today. And we're so grateful to Pew. I mean, Pew has done so much research on both religion and non-religion. We share the hesitation about the terminology. I'm sure we'll continue conversations. We all rely on the research that you're doing for our research, and I can't express our gratitude enough. And as you can tell, we could probably have a series of these talks. In fact, I'm wishing I had proposed that, because I have a sense that you could speak in any number of these areas and topics you've covered, and you could drill down a lot more. And so we may come back to you again. I could feel Zoom, the excitement over Zoom when you said the religious landscape survey. There's another round of that. I think people are genuinely excited and anticipating that. I was really interested, and I remain interested in the whole will to religion, will to non-religion. And I appreciate your commitment to trying to walk down that middle line where you're not on one side or the other, because we see in the scholarship a kind of pull in one direction or the other. People who are wanting, well, I want to count those bodies as religious. Well, I want to count those bodies as non-religious. It's a difficult line to walk, and we're all trying to do it. So I appreciate your willingness to engage in frank discussion, your willingness to debate ideas, your willingness to share your data, and for all the good research that you're doing. Really appreciate your time today and your engagement, and thank you so very much.
Thank you, Lori. That was lovely, really lovely. I appreciate it. And those who have continuing questions, or especially bones to pick or whatever was something that I said, because I may well have misstated, I may well be wrong. I am very open to being corrected. Feel free to reach me at acooperman@pewresearch.org, acooperman@pewresearch.org. Thanks again, Lori. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for the good work you and your team are doing. We're all in this together. It's not easy.
Exactly. Thanks, Alan. Thanks everyone for being with us.